Hello everyone, my name is Richard, and I'll be your instructor today for week 3 of Python courses in Beginner. Now, this week we'll be talking about operators, including comparison operators, arithmetic operators, as well as assignment operators. Each of these operators serve to have a key component in Python, so it will be very important for you to know these extremely well before we proceed with the course. So we will also be going over some example problems that will help you gain a better understanding of how you could use these operators, and I hope that you'll be able to understand them fairly well. So we'll be going over math operators first. So all standard math operations that you see in normal algebra will also apply here as well. For example, there is addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So most of these are fairly self-explanatory. For instance, x plus y is equal to 8 if x equals 5 and y equals 3. Same applies here. It's just a simple evaluation. However, for floating point division, you might want to note that there's actually two types of division, since you see another one right here. The main difference is that one of them is floating point, which basically means that this division operation could allow you to have numbers after the decimal, which means, for example, 15 over 4 is equal to 3.75. So that's for floating point division. However, for floor division, which is also sometimes called integer division, 5 over 2 is equal to 2. So in this context, the remainder is ignored. And afterwards, we basically apply what is called the floor operation to the floating point decimal to yield an integer. And that is basically what the integer division is, because it always ignores the remainder. Remember that. It always ignores the remainder. And you might also wonder, for instance, then what does this mean for negative numbers? Does it round up or round down? I'll show you in the next section when that happens. And afterwards, for modulo. Modulo is, in other words, an operation which helps you find the remainder when you divide two numbers. So if for some of you, if you have not taken algebra yet, then you might not know what modulo operation is. So just know that, for instance, there's always a quotient and a remainder, as you recall in your other classes. So what the modulo operator does is that it always returns the remainder when you divide two numbers. For instance, 14 divided by 3 yields 2, because 4 times 3 plus 2 is equal to 14. 2 is the remainder. And afterwards, for the exponent, basically it means, for instance, 2, 3, so 2 asterisk 3 basically means 2 to the power of 3. It just also means that for some of you who don't know what an exponent or a power operation is, it basically means that 2 to the power of 3 is equal to 2 times 2 times 2 equals to 8. So it means that 2 is multiplied 3 times to itself. Hopefully that you understand what exponents are, at least in basic terms, because that will help you understand this operation better. So now I want to suggest a free online code editor for all of you to use. Some of you will probably use IDEs, for instance, Eclipse or CodeBlocks. Those are all possibilities. But there's also an online editor, which allows you to avoid installing IDEs if you're just too lazy to do it. So I suggest repo.it, which is available here. And you can just type this in your browser and you should be able to access it. It is a free website where they allow you to choose any language you want. And afterwards, you could just run whatever program you choose on this website. So I suggest this one, since it's fairly convenient, and it's also the one I'm going to be using as well. So today, I'll be going over an example problem first, before I let you try a problem yourself. I hope that you find this example problem actually enlightening, because this will actually showcase for you how to approach the next practice problem that I have in store for you. This example problem actually is harder than the practice problem I'll give you. So let's get started. So power. Write a program that accepts two numbers, x and y. Compute and print the quantity x plus y to the power of 5. Display the entire equation. The program should accept decimals as inputs. So when you think of decimals, you think of float. So in other words, you also notice here that this requires user input, since it states that we need a program that accepts two numbers. So let's get started. So this is repo.it. I have already created a repo. And afterwards, so then we'll get started by inputting two numbers. You'll first write the input commands. So we'll just say number 1, and afterwards number 2 right here. So you'll notice that there's also you'll need to cast these numbers using this command right here, float parentheses, left parentheses, right parentheses. This is kind of needed because any thing that you receive from an input function is a string. So then you'll need to convert that to a decimal. And afterwards, you cannot convert them using integers because it will always be rounded down. So I advise you then to always to use float. As you see right here, it says convert a string or number to a floating point number if possible. So that's basically what it does. Next, you'll notice that it says compute and print an entire quantity x plus y to the power of 5. So we do that. So this is actually fairly simple, which is just this. If you recall, it's just this operation right here is the power operation. So we could use that to basically just show that, okay, it's basically accomplishing what the question asks for. If you didn't know, by the way, this means to the power of 5. It's basically the same thing as double asterisk in Python. So now it also wants us to display the entire equation. So there's actually many ways to do this. Most people would think of it doing this way, by quite literally just listing all the variables like this. So in other words, it is rather annoying, I suppose, simply because you have to like list all of these strings and separate them with commas. And afterwards, of course, this works, but it is also not ideal. So afterwards, we could just run this, and then we just say 2.3, and then 4.6, and then you'll get this. So this is also acceptable, but there's also one other way you could do this as well. We could exploit something called the F string. So basically what you could do is that you could insert, so this notation you might be surprised to see at first, but sometimes if you insert these curly braces, any variables that you specify within these curly braces will have the variable replaced with their actual value, as you'll see in a second. So in other words, when we try this again, and afterwards we do start to the power 5 is equal to, my mistake here, it's not supposed to have two equals. Anyways, is equal to result, and afterwards we print this instead. You'll notice the following. So we again do some interesting values, and afterwards we get 0.5 and 0.0 is equal to this right here. This is so obviously also an acceptable form of printing the equation. So you'll notice that the print function actually has a default separation between arguments because spaces are always included between each of these arguments. So that is something you can turn this off if you want by just specifying, for instance, this basically means no separation. So if we run this again, then let's say 0.6, 0.7, and then afterwards you'll notice that there's no separation in between them anymore, and you'll just have to add some spaces yourself if you really need to. So this kind of shows you how to do the first example problem that I have shown you. So this is just a basic problem that I expect that all of you sooner or later to know how to do. So then let us also try a problem yourself. So this practice problem states that we ask the user for a number and store it in a variable called x, divide the number x by 5, then add it by 2, and then store it in a variable called y, and afterwards please print the result. So I advise you to actually pause this video here and try this practice problem yourself to see how well you do. And afterwards, when you're stuck or you have found a solution, then you can unpause this video and then we'll just go over the solution. So I'll just give you a moment now to pause the video and then I'll wait for a bit. All right, so now I will go over the solution. I'm assuming that you now have come up with a possible solution, or you probably have need some help. And afterwards, this is what the solution would look like. So in other words, you'll notice here that since we only need an integer, so instead when we receive the input command, afterwards when we convert that to an integer, we use int instead of float. So instead there wouldn't be any, so there will not be any numbers after the decimal point. So you'll be guaranteed to get an integer. And then afterwards, when we come here, you'll notice that y is equal to x over 5 plus 2, and then we print y. So this right here, if we go to the previous problem, it states that we divide the number x by 5 and then add it by 2. So you notice right here that it's not asking for, it doesn't specify whether it's floating point or integer divide. So I used floating point here. You can also use integer divide here as well. So if you use double slash, that's also perfectly acceptable. So then afterwards, if y is equal to x over 5 plus 2, and afterwards we assign that to the value y, and then we print y, and afterwards that is the solution to our problem. So I think this is actually fairly simple in comparison to this problem right here I just shown you. This is a little more complex, since especially you have to actually print the equation, and afterwards that also might confuse some of you. So I hope that at the very least that you found this practice problem at least easier than the other problem that you have seen. So logic operators are used to combine truth values. Truth values are also known in other languages as Boolean values. Although Boolean is not a type that you see in Python that often, but it's still good to know what it is. And then we'll start out with the AND operator, which returns true only if both of the Boolean values or truth values are true. And it will return false if any of the truth values that it compares is false. For example, it says, say that your mom promised you to buy cookies and chips. If she buys both items, then she didn't break the promise. Elsewise, she broke the promise. Breaking the promise is equivalent to false. Fulfilling the promise is equivalent to true. Or, say your dad promised to buy you a computer or a bike for your 14th birthday. If your dad buys either the computer or the bike, then he has fulfilled the promise. Only if your dad didn't buy either did he break his promise. Breaking the promise is equivalent to true. Is equivalent to false. And fulfilling the promise is equivalent to true. So the OR is a slightly looser operator than AND, because as long as any one of the values that it's comparing is true, then it'll also return true as well. So it's only when both values are false, then that is when OR will return false. And afterwards, not basically means that it will return the opposite of the Boolean value that was passed. For example, not false returns true, and not true returns false. So this is an example of a logic operator. So we just noticed here that where cookie spot equals true, and where chip spot equals true. And we'll just notice here that if we compare these two, then for instance, where cookie spot and where chip spot, it will return true as well, simply because both of these values are also true. So you'll notice that if any one of these values is false, if, for example, if this is false, then this entire expression will return false as well. And if both of them are false, then obviously false will be returned. And afterwards, there's also the OR operator. And afterwards, you'll notice here that it has a slightly looser returns than AND, simply because if one of the values is true, one of the values is false, this will return true as well. It doesn't matter if, for example, if this is false and this is true, because this is symmetrical. So this expression will also return true. And afterwards, if only both of them are false, then will this expression return false. And not basically just conjugates the Boolean value or the truth value. And so, for example, not false returns true, and afterwards not true returns false. So then let's try an example problem ourselves. So this example asks us to write in Python syntax what you will say if you wanted not a drink or not a cookie. So I advise you to later when we try the practice problem to actually pause it and try the problem yourselves first before you actually see the solution. So we will actually try this example problem now. And afterwards, you'll notice that this is just a solution that I have typed up beforehand. You'll notice that want a drink is equal to true, want a cookie is equal to true. So I just assign these values myself arbitrarily. And afterwards, we notice that still the expression states that not a drink or not a cookie. So afterwards, I just did exactly what the problem stated. So we said not want a drink or not want a cookie. And afterwards, we put an OR operation in between these two results, and we printed them. And afterwards, when we run that, we get false, simply because not conjugates true, and that returns false for both of them. And the OR operator will return false, since that's equivalent to saying, oh, false or false, basically. So that is how we do this example problem. This is fairly simple in my opinion. So then this is the practice problem that I want you guys to try as well. So you want to write a Python syntax, what you will say if you wanted either a cup or 2 bottles and 1 duck. So in this context, you could just, for example, have 3 variables. Each of them has their own Boolean value. For example, want a cup is equal to true, want 2 bottles is equal to false, and want 1 duck is equal to true. You could also choose your own values, but afterwards, you want to write a Boolean expression that matches this one right here exactly. So I advise you then to actually try this problem out yourself and see how that works. And afterwards, we could always go over the solution afterwards. All right. So now I'm assuming that you have at least made some progress on this problem or have finished it. So this is the solution that I have come up with. So you'll notice right here that this is I'm actually asking the user whether or not I want a cup, want 2 bottles, or want 1 duck. So this is obviously quite different from the other problem that you see right here, since we're just assigning the values. So you just want to note here that if we actually want the user to like say whether or not I want a cup, if you press enter without typing anything to indicate the value false, because in Python, if you want to cast a string to a Boolean or truth value, then only the empty string will be cast to false. So by the way, bool right here means that you're casting the string to a Boolean value. So this is equivalent to int or float right here, if you didn't know. So they could also be used interchangeably to get Boolean, float, or integer values. So as I was saying though, only the empty string will indicate the value false. And afterwards, if you enter any character, even a dot, the word false or 0, it will always return true for want a cup, simply because the string is no longer empty. So if you want this value to be false, just hit enter without typing in any characters, and you'll find this value to be false. And afterwards, if you want this value to be true, just type any random character and this value will be true. And afterwards, you'll notice that per the problem requirements, we will do right here, it says wanted either a cup or 2 bottles and 1 duck. So we did that. It says want a cup or want 2 bottles and 1 duck, as they have noticed right here, and there's parentheses as well. And then you can just print the result as required. Now then, we'll be going over comparison operators. Comparison operators are ways to compare data that usually are, for instance, integers or as well as floats or floating decimals. So like that basically means that there's numbers after the decimal point. So then greater than means greater than equal to means at least, and afterwards less than means, well, this, and afterwards less than equal to means no more than, and afterwards 2 equal signs means equal to, and afterwards we just don't want to confuse this with one single equal sign. One is for checking for equality, while the other is for assignment. Never ever use a single equals sign in a Boolean expression, because that will mean sometimes that you are actually because the assignment operator, well, the single equal sign will also return a result as well. You'll learn more about this later, but this is a very, very hot point that you want to be careful of. And afterwards, not equals to basically means not. This exclamation mark right here means not. So this, in other words, means not equal to. So then this is just an example of some comparison operators. So for instance, it says print 5 is greater than 9, which is obviously false. And then 10 is greater than or equal to 9, which is true. And then afterwards, we could just like go over these other examples yourself. Please pause the video if you want to take a better look at this. But these are just standard arithmetic operators that you see, at least these 4 are the ones that you see in algebra fairly often. And afterwards, this is just basically tests whether or not 2 values are equal. And afterwards, these 2, this operator tests whether or not if these two values are not equal. As you see right here, 10 is not equal to 9, which returns true. 9 is not equal to 9, which returns false. So then let us also try a problem now. And afterwards, we could see that we're trying to this is a fairly basic problem. So we start with x equals to 10. And then we compare x with another number using the comparison operator, such that if you print x, a comparison operator, and then another number, it prints false. So obviously, with so many comparison operators, as we saw earlier, there's at least 6. You might be wondering like which ones you could use. Honestly though, any of them could be used for this problem. So you could list any of them and see which ones returns false. So then now we'll just go over the solution for this one. So these are just 4 examples. For example, if x is equal to 10, then obviously x less than 9 returns false. Similarly, if x is greater than 11, since that's clearly false as well. And then if x is also not equal to 10, since x is literally 10, that returns false. And then it's at least 11, returns false as well. So your solution might also include might use other operators. They're not listed in this solution, but this basically, if you already know how to do all 4 of these, then I'm fairly certain that you know how to use comparison operators fairly well. And afterwards, we'll now let you try to do a if you have time. I don't have a practice problem for you in this deck of slides, but I suggest that you also go farther in our Thinkific course to see some other practice problems that are available. I suggest that you try those, and then that will probably help you better understand as well. So to kind of go into our final section of this course, we will be going over augmented assignment operations. So the right and left columns are equivalent. So you'll notice that we have already gone over these before. So a is equal to a plus b, a equals a minus b. That is actually also equal to a plus equal to b, or a minus equal to b. So all of these operations are actually all equivalent. So like this is just another way of writing things. It's kind of like a shorthand. Suddenly, because you don't have to write that pesky extra a on the right side of the expression, but we could just perform this right here. So notice, if you didn't know, actually these operations can also be defined for classes that are not integers or floats. We'll go into that later in some other week in our Python course. But for now, just know that these operations will be performed on any number. And we will now show you an example. So we want to initialize a variable number with a value of 5, and afterwards, using augmented assignment operators, increase it by 4, decrease it by 3, multiply it by 2, and divide it by 3, and afterwards print the result. So what you guys want to do here actually is also to pause the video again, because this is actually fairly simple, because we're just using a different form of the operators that we have learned earlier. So I suggest that perhaps that you could also try this problem out yourself, and afterwards I'll get back to you in a bit. All right. So now I'll start discussing the solution for this problem, and you'll notice that we first assigned a value of 5, and afterwards we add 4 and then subtract 3, multiply that by 2, and afterwards divide that ultimately by 3. So then you'll notice that the value printed should be 4, because for instance, if we follow the operation 5 plus 4 is equal to 9. So after this operation, x is equal to 9, we subtract 3, x is equal to 6, multiply by 2 is equal to 12, and then 12 divided by 3 is 4. So you'll notice here that these are all augmented assignment operators. So I never used anything on the right here, but I only used operations on the left. So basically, we have used practically all 4 of these operators, except modulo. Except modulo could also be used in a similar manner. It should not be too difficult to add that in another practice problem. So I hope that you also have learned quite a bit with me in this course. And afterwards, this also ends our lesson for today. So just know that operators are a basic component of Python. So you want to be sure to know how to use them. They will be used a lot in other Python classes as well. If you didn't know, for instance, the add operation can also be used to add 2 lists, if you know what lists are. You'll learn about them surely enough if you do not know about them already. And afterwards, if you still have any further questions about either this video or any other problems that we have gone over in this presentation or on Thinkific, then you can visit us during office hours to ask any questions. Or you can always also contact us on Slack or Discord, and then we'll be happy to answer you. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and have a good day.